Oh, you disappeared, but I can, as long as you can see me, I think that's what's
Good
going on.
evening, Professor Steinberg in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us. I heard the term apartheid state used against Israel the first time back at the infamous UN Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001. That canard is mushroomed into a cottage industry, and here we are looking at another so-called Israel Apartheid Week on campuses around the globe. Professor Steinberg, you are the world's expert. How did we get to this point? Who's doing it? What can we do about it?
The NGO forum of the Durban conference in 2001 had 1,500 organizations involved. There were 4,000 or 5,000 people. You were there, you know the size of the crowd. And they laid it out very straightforwardly. They said they're going to use claims of war crimes, the apartheid libel, that kind of language, in order to, what they said was the complete international isolation of Israel. Using the South African model of what they did to the apartheid state, of course, completely distorting any of the reality in the process. That was about over 9 years ago, and that's exactly what these organizations have done and the people that were involved in them. So now we've got 30, 40 organizations, frameworks, many of which are funded very richly by European governments, that are promoting boycotts, divestment and sanctions, DDS, that are pressuring artists not to come to Israel, that are standing inside and outside stores in various cities around the world, harassing customers and trying to prevent people from buying Israeli products, disrupting performance of the Israeli Philharmonic, calling for boycotts of Israeli academics. It's across the board, and this is precisely what they said they were going to do. Israel Apartheid Week is really just another PR version of all that activity, centralized. They said it's a week, it's really over a 3 or 4 week period, and it's just another PR gimmick in that same process of de-legitimizing Israel, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination.
And you mentioned that there are governments that are involved in funding these efforts. Are those direct funding? Are they aware of their quote-unquote investment in this anti-Israel activity? And which governments are they?
Most of the government funding comes from about 15 Western European governments, including the European Union and various consortium that are out there. Somewhere around 100 million euros a year go to approximately 100 organizations, about 40 Palestinian groups like Al-Haq, Al-Mazar, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. We found out an organization called PARC, which ostensibly deals with agricultural activities, got $7 million from the Dutch government and refers to Israel frequently as an apartheid state, involved in this kind of boycott activity. So it's almost all the Western European governments, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, particularly involved the British government. It has been involved. They've cut back a little bit. And part of the reason that the Brits have cut back, and some of the other governments are looking at this in more detail, is that the heads of the governments didn't really know what was going on. In many, many cases, the foreign minister or the ambassadors to Israel will say to us that this is done by the development office. This is done by, in terms of direct funding, it's done by the Ramallah office. That's credit to the government. They get money straight from the government. It doesn't go through the foreign ministries. And they get very vague reports that said this money is being used for human rights, it's being used for democracy, it's being used for peace, which is probably one of the worst canards of this. The European Union has something called Partnerships for Peace. And of the roughly 20 governments, 10 of them are deeply involved in BDS, but they advertise it as part of peace, and promoting peace, and helping to create, for instance, Palestinian willingness to enter dialogues. And what they really mean is that this is part of promoting the Palestinian narrative and warfare and BDS. But at the top level, governments have not been looking at this. And that's not always the case. There are a few cases, like in Ireland, where I think that the heads of the government, the Irish government, was just much in fact. The new government will take a new look at this. But the Irish government, as we know, the top people were very, very aware of where the money was going. It was part of their ideology. Whereas in other countries, it was done by people at lower levels. There's a famous case in Holland, for instance, where this is indirect funding, which may be half of the total. Almost every European government gives huge amounts of money, at least 100 euros a year, to church groups that are responsible for international development and aid humanitarian issues. In Sweden, it's Diaconia. In Holland, it's a group called ICO, and there's similar groups around the world. And it turns out that the Dutch group ICO, which gets 134 million euros per year from the government for humanitarian assistance, has a Middle East branch, and the Middle East branch has a Palestine desk, and the Palestinian desk officer, the Palestine desk officer, writes for Electronic Intifada and was funneling money, a lot of money, large part of the budget that Electronic Intifada, which is a mainline BDS lawfare apartheid week NGO, is getting its money from ICO under the facade of Palestinian development, and it was carefully hidden in many layers of budget. You couldn't find it online unless you really dug and got it actually from somebody in the nearby office. So this is a very broad and well established channel for precisely these kinds of activities.
So briefly, in addition to Electronic Intifada, could you name the 4 or 5 other main NGOs that are at the core of this effort, or is it just much more diffused?
It's pretty diffused. I could give you a list of 30, but I can certainly name 4 or 5 that are at the forefront of this. I would say, for instance, on the Palestinian side, you have the organization Al-Haq, which is, again, well established, was around the days of Durban, gets money from a number of European governments, is considered to be the main Palestinian human rights organization. And much of their activity, they're behind a lot of lawfare cases, at least one that was dismissed, and even dismissed with costs against against a Canadian firm, was run by Al-Haq, and that shows you how deep their activities are. Many of the cases brought against, the lawfare cases brought against Israelis, and many of the BDS activities in North America and Europe come out of Al-Haq's activities. So that's clearly one example. On the Israeli side, there's an organization called the Coalition of Women for Peace, and they run a website called Who Profits. And it's who profits from the occupation, but it's much broader than who profits from the Israeli apartheid state. These organizations claim, many of them, that they are really only opposed to the occupation, but we don't dispute Israel's right to exist. But if you scratch the surface, you see that they're using terms like apartheid and calling for a one-state solution. So the Coalition of Women for Peace, an Israeli organization, which gets a lot of this money from the European Union and also from the Dutch government and other groups, has been pursuing this who profits and pressing various state-run pension funds, particularly in Scandinavia, successfully in terms of divestment, in terms of boycotts and similar activities. Clearly, the CWP, Coalition of Women for Peace, is a major culprit in the targeting of Israel through the BDS process. The third organization I'll name, and I said I could do more, but I think when you have the mainline, actually 2 more groups, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, when you have these international superpowers, the other groups I said are focused on Israeli-Palestinian issues. Human Rights Watch claims to be, and Amnesty claim to be international universal human rights groups. And they are treated as such. They have UN status, ECOSOC status. They sit on the dais with the head of the commissioner rather, for human rights always. And they're behind the Goldstone report and all of those things. And when you have Human Rights Watch and their head of the Middle East division, Sarah Leah-Witzke, who is a hardcore anti-Israel activist. That's the only thing she really has going for her. And when she comes out in favor of boycotts, and the Caterpillar boycott in particular, and the reports that are written and published by Human Rights Watch with the press conferences and the whole paraphernalia that takes place are specifically designed to help drive the BDS movement, then you know that these are pretty serious types of operations, and they do a lot of damage. They are part of the assault, the political warfare against Israel.
Last question, just if you can do it very briefly. You used the term lawfare. Can you just briefly explain what lawfare is, and why supporters of Israel are so concerned.
Lawfare is a very cynical exploitation of what's called universal jurisdiction, moral kinds of statutes that say that if a genocidal leader comes to your country, then your country has the right to arrest and try that person. It's based on the Nuremberg trials. It's another cynical example of how the whole human rights framework was adopted rather, after the Holocaust as part of a never again statement that was being used primarily against Israel and Jewish people. And lawfare takes place, cases against Israeli officials or Israeli firms or firms that do business with Israel have been filed in something like 10 or 12 different countries. And in no cases have any convictions been obtained. In every case, at some point, there's been a dismissal, usually at the very early stages of the trial, and it's simply done for PR. The purpose is so that when an Israeli official steps off a plane, if Tzipi Livni, the head of the opposition party, were to go to London, she would immediately be served with a subpoena and have taken for interrogation, because one of these NGOs, a group of them, have found some magistrate somewhere in the British system that's got enough of a chip on his shoulder or her shoulder against Israel to start this process. They have no legal merit, but there's funding and there's publicity behind it. And it is, as I said, a very cynical manipulation of a moral framework, and that's generally called lawfare, the use of legal processes for political warfare.
Thank you, Professor Steinberg. The Wiesenthal Center commends your trailblazing work, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Rabbi Cooper. It's always a pleasure to work with you in the Wiesenthal Center.
All the best.